In the meantime, in Caledon, woman Jessica and her child Paul of House Atreides are eating. Jessica believes her child should rehearse a power known as Bene Gesserit and advises him to utilize the voice, which ought to permit him to mind control individuals. Paul attempts to utilize it on her and falls flat, yet Jessica reminds him it requires a very long time to learn. She likewise inquires as to whether he's had any fantasies, and Paul contemplates the dreams of a young lady called Cheney. However, he lies and says no. After his feast, Paul becomes familiar with Arrakis, which is tormented by strong dust storms and monster sandworms. Long openness to zest is given the Freemen their trademark blue eyes, and they believe flavor to be holy. Notwithstanding, the ruler utilizes flavor to assist pilots with venturing to every part of the stars in a little while. Paul and his dad Duke Leto invited the envoy of the change, who has accompanied orders from the ruler place of students, will assume command over Arrakis and act as its steward. Duke Leto acknowledges and takes care of business with his ring. A while later, Paul meets with Duncan, the swordmaster of Place of Trades. Paul requests that Duncan take him to Arrakis with him and his group. However, Duncan declines, saying he'd be court-martial ed. Paul enlightens Duncan concerning the premonitory dreams he's had of Arrakis, making sense of he's seen Duncan with the Freeman and kicking the bucket in fight. In any case, Duncan actually says no on the grounds that he doesn't have confidence in the fantasies. Declining to surrender, Paul goes to see Leto to request consent to go with Duncan, yet Leto likewise denies, since Paul should be next to him when the family shows up in Arrakis. He fears a conflict is coming. That is the reason he sent Duncan ahead with a group to attempt to manufacture a collusion with the Freemen. Afterward, Paul trains at Blade, battling with Gurney, the Warmaster of Place of Trades, who is furious in light of the fact that Paul doesn't view preparing in a serious way and powers him into battle while utilizing a power field safeguard to keep the sharp edges from entering. They battle for a couple of moments and end in a tie, which would have been a common passing without the safeguards. Gurney cautions him how horrendous the Harkonnens are, so Paul ought to be prepared for war. In the meantime, in Gated Prime, the homeworld of House Harkonnen, Robin visits his uncle Noble Harkonnen to let him know that every one of their boats have left Arrakis. Enraged, he shouts as he asks why the Sovereign did this to them. But the Baron and his right-hand Peter mysteriously say that a gift isn't always a gift. Back in Caledon, Jessica wakes Paul in the middle of the night because Reverend Mother Gaius of the Bene Gesserit school is here and wants to meet Paul. Apparently Jessica told her about his dreams first. Drive UA checks Paul's vitals, and he uses the chance to whisper to Paul that while the Bene Gesserit claim to serve the greater good, they also serve their own agenda. Then UA that Paul's heart is strong, and Jessica uses sign language to ask him to keep the secret on their way to see the Reverend Mother. Jessica uses sign language again to tell Paul to remember his training. When they enter the room, Reverend Mother Gaius orders Jessica to wait outside, and Jessica tells Paul to do everything that Gaius says before leaving. Paul is angry that Gaius gave an order to his mother, but she uses the voice to draw him closer and force to his knees. Then Gaius instructs Paul to place his hand in a box as she holds a poisoned needle to his neck. If he takes his hand out of the box before she tells him to, she will kill him with a needle. Paul begins feeling unbearable pain, but as Jessica recites the litany against fear, he starts seeing his visions of the desert and keeps his head up. Paul passes the test and is allowed to take out his hand, which is uninjured. Gaius tells him that if he had been unable to resist his impulses like an animal, she would have had to kill him because he has inherited too much power from his mother. Then she asks him about his dreams, so Paul tells her about the girl in the desert. Afterward, Gaius leaves, but on her way out, Gaius reminds Jessica that to train a man for the Bene Gesserit was against the rules. That's why Paul had to be tested. It turns out Jessica had been instructed to bear only daughters, but her pride made her believe that she could give birth to the chosen Messiah. After Gaius leaves, Jessica turns to discover that Paul overheard their conversation. He accuses the Bene Gesserit of steering the Imperium's politics from the shadows, but his mother LLS him there's more to it than that. The Bene Gesserit has worked for generations to bring forth the one, a mind powerful enough to bridge space and time, the past and the future. They believe Paul might be that person, but Paul is sad that he's just part of a plan. Soon the family packs everything up and arrives in Arrakis. They are greeted by cheers from the Freemen and Paul wonders what they're saying, so Jessica explains they're calling him Messiah in their language. After a long flight over the desert, they make it to the city of Araucine, which is protected by a wall from the weather and the sandworms. In his room, Paul learns more about the planet. To avoid attracting sandworms, the Freemen cross the desert using the sandwalk, a special walk that mimics the natural sounds of the desert. Suddenly Paul notices a tiny floating machine used by assassins entering through a small hole in the wall. The device flies toward Paul only to stop as they stare at each other. When a servant enters the room, Paul snaps out of it and grabs the device in his hand, crushing it. Afterward, the guards are alerted and they find the assassin dead inside a wall, had been cemented into a crevice 6 weeks before and had been waiting for the right time to strike. Meanwhile, a Bene Gesserit sister meets with Baron Harkonnen and Peter to bring a message from the Emperor, who has promised to strengthen Harkonnen's forces with his own elite military force, the Sardaukar, but nobody can know about it. The sister also tells them that they may kill Leto, but that Jessica and Paul must be kept alive. Harkonnen gives his word that he will not harm them, but after she leaves, the Baron tells Peter to kill the whole family anyway. Sometime later, Leto and his council decide they will have to inspect. The sister also tells them that they may kill Leto, but that Jessica and Paul must be kept alive. Harkonnen gives his word that he will not harm them, but after she leaves, the Baron tells Peter to kill the whole family anyway. Sometime later, Leto and his council decide they will have to inspect the spice silos because it seems they were sabotaged by the Harkonnens, so they'll have to wait for the Judge of Change to oversee the process. At that moment, Duncan arrives and tells them about his mission. He lived with the Freemen for 4 weeks and learned that there are millions of them on Arrakis, some located in tunnels below ground that Harkonnen didn't know of. Duncan has also brought Stilgar, the leader of a Freeman tribe, to meet the Duke. After Leto greets him, Stilgar spits on the ground, but this is a sign of respect in his culture and Leto returns the gesture. Stilgar tells them that they are outworlders who take spice and give nothing in return, so Leto responds that he knows the Freemen have suffered and promises his people will leave them alone. Stilgar accepts this as honorable and turns to leave, but Paul asks him to stay. Sadly, Stilgar can't stay, but he tells Paul in his language that he recognizes him. Afterward, Duncan shows them some of the technology he's borrowed from the Freemen, including a paracampus which can tell direction despite magnetic interference. Sometime later, Leto and his people meet the Judge of Change. Her kinds and her attitude almost gets her killed by the guards. She proceeds to inspect the still suits they're wearing to make sure they're in good condition, otherwise they won't survive in the desert. Suddenly, Kynes notices the way Paul is wearing his boots in a non-standard fashion and asks who taught him to do it, but he says it just felt like the right way. Then Kynes takes them to see the harvesting fields aboard 3 aircraft. The harvesting crawler is harvesting spice from the surface, while a spotter is on the lookout for sand waves that indicate worm activity. The worms travel deep, but they're attracted by noise and vibration. They can't use shields because those attract worms too. At that moment, Leto spots a sand wave and Kynes calls for a carryall to retrieve the crawler. The carryall arrives and lands on the crawler, but a malfunction causes the carryall to fail at picking up the crawler. This means the crawler's crew is in danger, so Leto decides that they will use the 3 aircraft to save them. As soon as the aircraft land near the crawler, Leto orders his men to throw out the shield generators to make room. Then he calls out over the radio for the men to leave the crawler and come aboard. The carryall flies away as the worm comes closer and the crew is guided by Paul toward the aircraft. However, he suddenly freezes when he falls into a trance. Leto is about to take off when they realize Paul isn't on board and the worm is almost there. Now Paul falls to his knees and hears weird words in his mind before he starts whispering to himself. Luckily, he's pulled from his daze by Gurney and together they begin running, only to be knocked down as the worm starts to break the surface, causing the sand to sink in. The duo quickly regains their feet and makes it to the aircraft, which flies away as they watch how the sandworm swallows the crawler whole. Back at the base, Leto tells Kynes that she must realize that the Harkonnens left them faulty equipment to ensure that they fail, but she says the carryall was merely old A while later Paul is inspected by Ua, who says that Paul is by all accounts delicate to flavor. However, he'll be fine. After Ua leaves, Paul lets Jessica know that he didn't have an unfavorably susceptible response, he really had a dream. He depicts what he saw about the desert, the conflict, and in any event kissing Cheney, saying that it was confounding in light of the fact that he saw his thought process was his demise yet wasn't.